Timeless, the human experience through a quantum lens. Hello and welcome to Timeless, a podcast with me, Isabel Soden.
And myself, Clive Hyland.
We are talking about organisations.
And myself, Clive Hyland.
Clive, quantum organisations. Quoi?
Okay, so starting with link it back to the last conversation we had and about the importance of subjectivity in the subjective experience. Okay, so this is a way of thinking about what a quantum organization could look like and some of the key principles involved in that. And it starts from, a challenge to the way that current organizations view productivity. There's an obsession, understandable, about measuring output, and it's normally based on linear measurement principles, etc., etc. Okay, and I totally get that because businesses need to be sustainable. If they're not commercially sustainable, then there's no life or no opportunity for growth of that business and the people in it. So there's everything in what I'm trying to say now is trying to support that commercial success needs to be part of the success of that organization. But the challenge that I would throw out there is like this preoccupation with output. Now, we know we need to end up with tangible results, fair enough, but there's not enough attention given to where does that come from. So there's a lot of emphasis on behavior and managing behavior because it's perceived to be controllable, or at least controllable to an extent. But it's the subjective nature of our experience that drives how we behave. And so little attention is given to what goes on at a subjective level. But we know that it's the subjective realm and the unconscious realm that is the source of experiences like motivation. Now, we can pin motivation down a lot more in the brain. We understand, the role of the dopamine circuits in the brain and how they motivate at different levels. And we can have that discussion. But it's the essence of this is, I'm trying now to focus more on the organization rather than the science. But it's really to say, we need to be a lot better at tapping into what's going on below the surface. And I'm not saying nothing is down. People go on leadership courses, for instance. But that realm, again, is very limited in what it looks at. And particularly the organization structures still lend themselves to putting people in boxes. And to me, that is the fundamental mistake. It's all about hierarchy, boxes, control, process, procedures, etc., etc., etc. And there's a hidden price for that people hitherto haven't understood, which is that is suppressing natural talent. I sense you're going to throw a question at me.
No, I was just thinking as you were saying that the sort of the measurable unit of output has seduced us into a way of thinking about the whole organism and the people and the process.
Yeah. So, as I've said, there's no doubt it has to materialize what we're doing. But for instance, for me, let's take a classic that links back to the previous conversations. So few organizations, if any, really tap into understanding things like energetic connection between people. Okay? So they will do a certain amount of psychological stuff and hope that some of that sticks. But energy is a reality that sits at the foundation of our experience and who we are. And yet it's never on the agenda. So understanding how people connect and how organizations can connect themselves, the essence of the brain's intelligence is connectivity. So we take that into the human behavior space, and it's all about connectivity and putting people in a situation where they can thrive. And that sort of takes us into the concept of what a quantum organization could look like. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I want, within human behavior, how is energy? Is it simply not acknowledged, or how is it treated?
Well, I think it's a bit like, emotions have been and still are largely. It's almost like we don't understand it, therefore we can't handle it, we can't control it, therefore we'll dismiss it, we'll marginalize it. We focus on the things we can control. You can see that in many areas, and we've touched on it in science, is, don't get distracted by the weird stuff. But, emotions and energetic connection, because emotions are just, packages of energy in essence, is basically, that's the level of understanding that I think we need to tap into now, because there's a whole realm there that is not acknowledged and understood. And again, it's not just opinion. We can bring the science back into play in order to back that up.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, if we, refer across to high performance areas such as sport, okay, but it can be other areas.
Well, that feels like a field that's more open to this kind of energetic realm of performance and being.
Yeah, I think so, because what sport has learned is that, if you take the classic sort of footballing type analogy, footballers arrive week to week with the same skill and talents and fitness as they had the week before, largely, unless they've been injured. But the reality is that their form and their confidence changes week by week, or they can have runs of positive momentum or negative, type stuff. And so why is that the case? Now, to be fair, even in sport, there's a lot now in terms of the data science around controlling the physiology of performance, but it's still very lacking in terms of trying to nail down the subjective experience, right? So great stuff in terms of understanding what the body can handle, yeah, but very little, again, even now, in terms of what the mind can handle. But the reason that I make the reference to sport is that because people in sport are generally familiar with the whole concept of being in the zone.
Mm-hmm.
And in the art world, we talk about being in flow, yeah? And this is simple and simple. Because it basically, the basis of that is synchronicity in the human body, in the intelligence systems. And what we understand by that, and this is all lab tested, very positive, provable results. It's all about connection between the brain, the heart, and the gut. These are the key players in this. So it's not, you cannot get into a state of confidence by thinking it through.
Mm-hmm.
If that was the case, we'd all think ourselves into a confidence space. But confidence starts with the heart. And it's an electromagnetic experience in the body that, whereby the heart sends out certain rhythms and beats, which in train or brings together, aligns both the gut and the head brain, what we normally call the brain, brings them all together as one intelligence system that is synchronized. So it's like the orchestra, the conductor of the orchestra, bringing all the instrument players together and saying, right, this is the beat that we're going to perform on.
Mm-hmm.
And when they come together at that beat, and it happens at 0.1 hertz is the frequency, then our potential performance dramatically increases. You literally see the spikes, you can see it in lab conditions, and the whole thing just goes off the scale. And we can then perform at a level which is typically 5 times more than normal operating experience. Okay. And we call that the zone, because we know any sportsman who's been there and experienced that will know it's not just an improvement on your incremental performance. It is something that's different. It feels different because you're in a special place. For a while you feel superhuman because you are superhuman. And so it's like understanding concepts like that, and now there's productivity potential that we're just not tapping into, both personally and collectively, means that there's this wasteland out there that could be brought in to bear in organizations, to have impact. And, there's a technical term called power spectral density by which we measure this, which is basically the amount of processing that you can put through a particular, frequency, in essence. And basically, that's about getting ahead of the game. If we can process information and everything comes back to information at that accelerated speed, we're ahead of the game and we're ready to react. So in the sporting world, that's about if you're a cricketer and the fast ball is coming at you, if you're in normal space, that ball's bloody quick and it hurts, and it's very difficult to handle. I know from experience. But when you're in the zone, it feels like a beach ball. It's coming at you at an altogether slower speed, and you're just taking your time to decide where you're going to hit it. Okay? Now, batsmen will go through that in their experiences, batters, I should say. So basically, it's like linking into that stuff and say there's a level of science that is helping us to understand what's going on there. Now, for the heart and the brain and the gut to be synchronized, you have to reach a state of belief. So belief is the experience that binds it all together. So in essence, the zone performance is where you're totally immersed in the challenge that's in front of you. You know you can do it because you've been practicing it forever. The zone doesn't allow you to do things you couldn't do out of the zone, but it's the level of performance you achieve when you step into that place, right? And it's it's a place then where everything comes together and the mind and the body are all focused on that one output. And that's the way to get the best out of yourself, okay? But it's the whole point, it's a whole level, another level. It's not just the odd 10% improvement. Yeah, and yet we don't explore that. So it's part of this then is the challenge to say, hold on a minute, the energetic flow of a business, the way that a business manages energy, manages connection, and manages the information exchange around that is fundamental to really establishing further opportunities for peak performance.
So you mentioned it in the field of sports people, and you mention it in the field of art. Is there a reason? And so you mentioned sport, art, and you also mentioned belief. And I wonder if a lack of the kind of prevalence of flow or the zone in the corporate world is to do with belief and passion. Like, do you have to love what you're doing in order to get in the zone?
Yes, I think you do. That's a fair way of expressing that. We can all perform, and most of us do perform to a level which is, will give the organization enough for us to survive, stay in our jobs. We can all play that game, right? And that's just functional performance, right? So, and most organizations settle for that, okay? Because it's controllable, it's on a behavior level, at least we can monitor that so we know we get in some sort of safety net of performance. But my challenge is to sort of say, if you let certain things go, if you let the organization become more organic in the way that it performs and evolves, there's a lot more that can be given. Because in essence, what this is about is saying people will give you as much as they want to give you. And they are very clever at making sure they hit the minimums, right? And they won't give you any more than that if they don't want to. Now, if they are passionate about something and really committed and believe in something, they will want to give you more. It's part of our DNA. Right?
Well, it's a sort of energy-saving machine. It's the same principle.
Yeah, that's right. Because if there's no excitement, no motivation involved, then you just have to manage the normal operating flow of the organization. Whereas if you are motivated, you want to give more, but you want to give it for personal reasons, ultimately. Because you want to put yourself out there, you want to experience yourself excelling, and you want to experience the acknowledgement that you get back for that. Because it's self-reinforcing that sort of says, oh, this is cool, I'm in a good place. I'm appreciated, which supports my emotional needs, and I'm performing, which supports my growth needs, and it all sort of becomes mutually reinforcing. So, but the problem is with hierarchies and control paradigms that we currently have in place is this sucks that out of people. It's like, no, this is the way you have to perform. You're in a box. We just want you to do these things. Just stick to your job description. Don't worry about other stuff. Now, I'm exaggerating. Obviously, there's some better practices in that. But that's the essence of the way that we build organizations.
The systems.
It's just boxes in boxes. And the universe doesn't do boxes. There are no straight lines, no hard edges in the universe. There's just energy and the energy that flows. So this is a part of us waking up to the reality that we are not getting the best out of our people at a collective and personal level because of the way that we run our organizations. And it's mainly because, again, it's back to this whole thing about emotions and all that stuff. We don't understand it, we can't handle it, therefore we can't manage it. So let's do something we can manage. But those organizations that go beyond that will excel and will sustain much more effectively than those that hang on to these old thinking patterns. Make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was just thinking, could that literally translate to something being 5 times more productive, an organization being?
Yeah, I mean, not on a total basis, because the thing about the zone is that you can't stay there. It's temporary because like the heart, the brain and the gut, they've got their daytime job to do, right? So occasionally it's like an orchestra. You still have to practice your instruments. You still have to maintain your expertise and that. But occasionally you can come together and just do something amazing. Okay, so it's the same principle here. But obviously, if organizations can increase the number of times they can get into the flow, particularly when it matters, then that's a huge return. All right. So it's like when it matters most, then people have to go back to their functional roles, just like the body does. But when it really matters, or when you as a person, when you're going to deliver a keynote speech or whatever it is, if you know your process, your ritual to get back into the zone, that's a great place to be. And you will up your level of performance.
Yeah. So how do organizations support their people to get into that?
Okay.
State.
So it's a balancing act of like cultural and structural principles. Okay. Because obviously you can't divide the one from the other. So fundamentally, the starting point is about being genuinely people-centric. Right. And I'm not convinced by 90% of the claims that I hear from organizations that say it's all about the people. And yet most of the practices they perform are not about the people. Mm-hmm. They're about securing the organization. Yeah. Now, again, I don't think in a lot of cases that's sinister or malevolent. It's because it's what they know and understand with their current thinking patterns. Right? But what we've got to say to people is, look, this isn't just a hit and hope thing. There's science on the table now that enables us to say if you let certain things go, such as hierarchical control, then you will find you have a vastly different and richer pool of talent to tap into. So let's take with the structural side first of all. Under no circumstances am I saying there's no rules, because that's chaos, right? But it's the level of rules. Because if you look at the universe, for instance, the universe is self-organizing. Mm-hmm. You take that principle into the working space, the same principles apply, and it's about creating communities that share responsibilities. It could be a marketing community, a production community, whatever it is. But you're not just changing the language. The essence of it is there's a real connection there between the people that operate in that community, and communities care, right? Organization boxes don't care. But also it's about giving a lot more ownership over to the people to run those areas and allow them to become self-regulating. Now, for a lot of people used to traditional organization, that's a scary thought, and it sounds like risk and chaos. But people are built to want to perform. Mm-hmm. And top-level teams and top-performing teams are self-regulating because they won't allow somebody to come in and pull the performance down. They enjoy the space of being recognized and experiencing their own success. Okay, so another little insight into this is about sort of saying, okay, if there's a performance problem with an individual in the team, that's the team's problem. And it's up to the team to resolve that and not to just dump it at the door of the manager. That's what happens at the moment. That's not my problem. I'm not here to manage other people's performance. And of course, there's different ways of going about it. But there are ways that teams naturally basically flag to people if they are cutting it and if they're not cutting it. And that doesn't need to be in an aggressive, uncaring way. It's much more about matching skills and motivation to what the team needs. So there needs to be a far more constructive conversation around this is what we need. Is this what you can give us? And some latitude around that. But ultimately, if that doesn't work, it's because it's not a match. Mm-hmm. It's not because there are good people and bad people. It's just not a match. And then it's about going, if people can't succeed in that organization, it's better for them to go. So they should be allowed to go with honor, providing they've given it a real attempt, of course. And it's very different to the sort of shame approach there is now to performance management and dismissal, where somebody's failed. But actually, it's a matching principle. That's what really matters. So teams will become self-regulating because that's the basis of high performance. But you can see that's a real demand for leaders to allow that level of perceived control to slip away. But that perceived control is an illusion, because all you can do is control behavior. And you still have the employees themselves deciding how much they're going to give you. And nothing will change that. Something
that I was talking the other day to someone who works in organizations. This one of the key problems is conflict avoidance.
Yeah.
But it sounds like a self-regulating team has to have a level of confidence to confront difficult, it can't be afraid of friction within the team. And that has to have psychological safety underneath it.
Definitely.
And that it is an ecosystem that really has to come from the people inside it.
Definitely.
That's not a top down.
No.
You know, that's not a
Yes.
memo on a Monday. That's a sense of safety.
Yeah, totally. And it's a great illustration, but it doesn't have to be like comfort either. So what I mean by it is yes, you need to feel trusted enough to be able to share vulnerabilities, for instance, to talk openly in the team about where things are going well and where they're not going well, and to trust other people's intentions. And we're a long way from that in many cases, right? So clearly there's investment in a new type of leadership that's necessary, which nurtures things like trusted environments, all right? But it's also with the clear understanding that trust is there in order to see performance. Mm-hmm. It's not trust for its own sake. It's to create an environment where we can see the evidence of trust in performance. That's the whole point, So it's still aligned, but it is very much about getting people to align their inner experience to what the organization is trying to achieve, and not to be controlled from the outside. Yeah, because you can't do it on that basis. So this whole principle of self-organization and emergence sounds scary, but that's the point. People need to understand it. It all comes back to opportunity to perform. Because people will want to. So obviously there's the natural things like trust, and a sense of empowerment, and on the case of the people in the organization, the employees, is there's a real push towards self-awareness. You cannot go into organization not being aware of what impact you have on other people. Right. So there's a whole new emphasis then on what am I doing, the impact I'm creating, is that what the team needs? Huge emphasis on feedback, which needs to be given in the most constructive possible way, but it needs to be there, and not learning not to be defensive, or any sort of so-called negative feedback hurts, but it can be presented in a way that is all about growth, so this is your opportunity for growth. And, so much of current feedback doesn't work that way, and it's understandable because our first instincts are to look for threat.
I was going to say, it goes back to if you're in threat detection mode, then any kind of feedback is perceived as must fight this, must reject this.
Absolutely.
This is a threat.
Yeah, because if your performance management system has already created conditions that, where you expect it to suffer in some way as a result of the negative aspects of an appraisal, then of course you're going to be on your guard, and that will stop you being honest. Even if you try to be. But if you're in a situation where you genuinely believe that the feedback has been presented to enable you to grow, to contribute further to the team, that's a very different experience. But most people want feedback in organizations, but they're afraid of it because they need to know how they're perceived, but normally it's delivered in such a destructive way that it actually makes progress harder rather than easier.
So give me quantum leadership in one sentence.
Yeah. In one sentence, okay, I can have a few clauses then.
Yeah.
So the essence of it really is that on the back of that is to say leadership in the future is going to be leadership and not management. All right? It's not about the management of tasks. It's about creating belief systems, enabling motivation and trust, looking at team harmony, and team dynamics that sort of pulls that together, and having real people competence skills to fine-tune yourself to what is needed to achieve the task of the team and at the individual level. So what that means is, the future cannot be about leaders falling back on organizational authority. Ultimately I'll do it because I'm the boss. Even if it's not said, it's often implied. And it's much more about you have to be able to handle the whys of the argument. The purpose of, you doing this stuff is this is how it fits into the organization, and that's why it's an important contribution. So it all lends itself towards things like the ability to inspire, to motivate, to coach, to mentor, much more important skills in a quantum organization that I think we'll need in the future compared to what we have now. There should be no control paradigm. It's all about you and your personal skills as a leader, how you connect with people and how you can create the best possible response from your people. Make sense?
Yeah, and in our landscape, more prescient than ever, more urgent than ever, as AI takes over, as the system and process is being outsourced.
Precisely.
And the human element of leadership is going to be the differential.
It is. To me, it's already interesting, that people are starting now, in a very short period of time, are starting to see some of the challenges with AI as well, that it can't always be trusted in terms of its output. And, that should have been clear from the start, but that's okay. We have to go up the learning curve on that. But basically, all the stuff that can be rapidly processed and repeatedly processed is going to be taken over by intelligent machinery, right? So absolutely, then we have to ask ourselves what's left. If we take all that rational control stuff out, what's left to us as human beings? And it's all the stuff we've been talking around about emotional connection, instinctive safety, imagination, all of that stuff. And now we pull that together to work with that technology where necessary in order to achieve the best result. So what's the point of having managers that have been groomed largely to look after the rational processing stuff when that rational processing stuff is being taken over?
Yeah.
So this is a here and now. And I'm even finding now already people are saying to me, we're sick of the virtual experiences. And when it comes to things like training and development, it's worth the effort of getting back together face to face, because they're acknowledging that the lack of the energetic element of the experience, it means it's demotivating, that we need to experience other energetically. Mm-hmm. So it's just, a little example. It's more efficient to do things virtually. Yeah, undoubtedly. And sometimes that's fine, but it's more about information exchange. But where it's about genuine development and changes of mindsets and that stuff, we need to be together. We need to feel that energy. I
mean, I think, I do feel like the efficiency myth is almost bursting slightly. We can get our Amazon packages, we can get our, whatever. Yeah. We can get everything delivered. We can get our food delivered. We can not leave our home to work. We could have entire relationships with our AI bots if we train them.
Yeah.
But that is leading to isolation and dysfunction and, huge amounts of anxiety and, mental health crises.
Yeah. And it's interesting, if you like, both the psychological and neuroscientific makeup of the brain, it's very much that stress causes separation. Yeah. So basically it causes disintegration of the brain. It damages the overall connectivity of the brain. It compartmentalizes it in a way, so that the natural connections no longer flow in balance, right, to the same degree. So the consequence of that is that we are not tapping into the full potential of our brain because we need everything. The perfect healthy brain is a brain that's fully connected. Okay. And just to make it relatable, ultimately this separation caused by stress can result in things like psychosis and split personalities. It's literally parts of the brain start to almost, create separate voices that are experienced in the mind. We want the opposite of that. What is one mind, everything's connected. And it's then the same principle in our organization. Everything's connected, it's flowing. Whenever organizations start to go down the quantum route, they immediately start to experience that cross-departmental flow of information is much more motivating to people than up-down.
Yeah.
Leaders are very much concentrated in general on looking after their own patch, siloed organizations, which reinforces the up-down flow, in order to protect those silos in that organization. Yeah. But actually what most people want is, and sometimes they don't know they want it until they experience it, and then they see the connection between themselves and other departments, and then it's all about the flow of energy and information across that organization. So it's a different empowerment experience because people want to know where they fit, just like we do in the universe.
I was about to say, this is like a fractal pattern from the minute to the...
It's exactly that, and that's why I keep saying everything that we need is already in the universe. We just have to have the power and to spot it and to understand it and take it into our normal operations. We've this cul-de-sac that we've taken away from those natural powers that we have in the organization and in the universe. It's a cul-de-sac that's not serving us. We need to find different ways.
I keep thinking of like a river, water finding its way down.
Absolutely.
And then those great big cement dams.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, look at my muscular cement massive wall, and like the water bursts through it.
Yes, it will. It's eventually, or you'll just get it seeping around. And basically what it means is that the organization is not fulfilling anything like its potential.
No.
It's
just leaking.
Yes, it's gone for the safest option, which it perceives to be controllable, which is an illusion.
Yeah.
And at the moment, people are, organizations to a degree have got away with that because all organizations are doing the same. But as people cotton onto this stuff and start recognizing, actually, by being more imaginative, being more connective, more collaborative, by being more mutually encouraging, genuinely, and not playing at it, we can take this organization to a new performance level. And then the organizations that hold on to the past thinking are going to be shown up as uncompetitive. That has to happen.
And it's just that kind of the intelligence of energy hitting a problem and finding the solution, and those that don't acknowledge the problem and seek the solution will just Well, fundamentally the concept that the organization should be there to support the people. Yeah.
The way it currently works is the people are there to support the organization.
Yeah.
So these are the boxes, they're unchallengeable, you've got to fit into them. Should be the other way around. How can the organization get the best out of its people? And a lot of that is giving more freedom, not total freedom, but it's about freedom in which motivation and trust can flourish. When you look at what's happening in neurodiversity and the growing number of people that are being diagnosed with neurodiverse conditions and anxiety disorders, that's not just a matter of increased reporting. There's real stuff going on there, and we have an understanding of what sits behind that. And we don't have the time here to get all of that on the table. But a key part of that is sensory overload. That basically the amount of information we as a species are trying to handle now is far beyond anything that any species, including earlier humans, has ever had to handle.
Can I just that amazing statistic that we process as much information in one day as someone did in their entire lifetime 150 years ago?
I can totally believe that. Yeah. And it's crazy. So our brains are trying to evolve to cope with this, right? But they're getting stretched out of shape.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what's happening, the mechanisms we're having for filtering information and only concentrating on what's important are being weakened. So we're seeing neurodiverse conditions coming along where people have to, they don't have the natural mechanisms in place to handle this information overload. Okay. And that can result in things like autism as an example. Okay. Where normally for autistic people, it's about having structures in place that allow them to stem the flow of that information, which is why their routines are really important to them. But it can also result in things like ADHD, where people are off, they can't offer attentional focus, again, because their minds are bouncing in trying to catch up in their way with the amount of information they've been asked to handle.
And you're proposing this is not to do with more advanced awareness and better diagnostic tools. You're saying this is the brain's response to sensory overload.
Absolutely. This is where I move from the world of science, not into pure intuition, but clearly there's intuition and there's opinion here, right? And that's because we can't generate enough intergenerational research yet to be able to say this is proven. But to me, it's totally plausible because our brains are being bent out of shape to cope with this new demand, all right? And that's resulting in divergent brains and divergent behaviors. Now, the way I want to link that back into the organization space is to say, you better get used to it because all our brains are becoming more and more divergent because they have to. Mm-hmm. The environment that we've created now is that we have to handle information in a different way. And we're in the process of trying to work out exactly how we should do that. So in the employment space, stop being afraid of neurodivergence, stop being awkward around it, invest in understanding it, because actually there are major opportunities. When you talk with people with ADHD who can get into hyperfocus, as they call it, which is a phenomenal commitment to seeing something through. And you can see, for instance, the research and tenacity qualities of people with autism. There are some real high performance statistics in people with divergent behavior. Mm-hmm. But what we've done is polarized it. Again, we said we don't understand it. It doesn't belong here. Put it in the corner.
They're in the other bin.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like there's a gap between us, but it's nonsense. We're all on a range of typical and untypical behavior. We all experience things like obsessive behavior on times, anxiety, mood swings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which are often classified alongside neurodiverse behavior. So the reality is we are going in this direction. And the key thing is to understand why and tap into it. Because for everything we lose, the brain gives us something else. It gives us another processing capability. Mm-hmm. And it's to understand that and create more divergent teams in the future that are not there just playing factory roles, if you understand what I mean as a concept, but are there because of what they can bring. Mm-hmm. And it's that multiplicity of talent that actually, that's the bedrock, of the survival of the species, but obviously the survival and growth of the organization as well. Tapping into that and creating something special.
And it just speaks to all of the qualities of the quantum leader.
Absolutely, it does. That's why it has to be people-centric. Do I understand my people? How do I improve that? How do I get what helps them perform? Mm-hmm. And how do I create that environment for both a personal and collective environment?
Great.
Yeah, we could spend forever on that discussion.
Oh, we
but
definitely
it does
could,
fit.
yeah.
It does fit. We have to be more open now in the way that we organize organizations.
Yeah. But I think there is a real call to action in that the landscape of the workforce, the workplace, everything's changing. Yeah. And so it's not a nice to have. It's not like, gosh, have you considered this really innovative Silicon Valley way of doing this? It's like, no, this level of innovation has to happen across every industry, across all parts of industry and society, because the face of things are changing.
That's the environment we've created.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you. That was fascinating.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and please do come back for the last episode in our first series of the Timeless podcast on quantum thinking, the way forward and the future.